Europe was starving, factories were silent, and Moscow was watching for the next collapse. The Marshall Plan was America's answer, not a threat. A rebuild so massive it denied the Soviet Union its easiest weapon: desperation. This is a story about how the United States fought a battle without firing a shot. How American resources, organization, and strategic thinking were deployed not to destroy an enemy but to strengthen allies. How money and logistics became instruments of power as effective as any military campaign. The year was 1947. Europe was heading into another brutal winter, and the suffering showed no signs of ending. The destruction of 6 years of conflict had not been repaired. The economies that had once made Europe the industrial center of the world remained paralyzed. And in the gap between what people needed and what their governments could provide, dangerous alternatives were taking root. The Soviet Union did not need to invade Western Europe to extend its influence. It only needed to wait. Wait for the factories to stay silent. Wait for the food to run short. Wait for the winters to break the will of populations that had already endured so much. Wait for the political systems to crack under the weight of problems they could not solve. American leaders understood this danger. They understood that the commitment made through the Truman Doctrine, the promise to support free peoples against subjugation, meant nothing if those peoples could not feed themselves, heat their homes, or find work. Military aid could not solve an economic crisis. Political declarations could not fill empty stomachs. What was needed was something different, something unprecedented in scale and ambition. A program that would treat the recovery of Europe not as a collection of national problems but as a continental challenge requiring a continental solution. A commitment of American resources so substantial that it would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the post-war world. Historical records and first-hand accounts from this period reveal how the program was conceived, designed, and implemented. The debates within the administration about what could be done and what must be done. The calculations about what Congress would accept. The coordination required to move resources across an ocean and distribute them effectively across a shattered continent. This is the story of that program, of how the United States made a strategic choice to invest in the recovery of its former enemies and current allies, of how that investment changed the course of history. The plan was not made to impress. It was made to prevent a collapse. To understand why the recovery program was necessary, you have to understand what Europe looked like in 1947. The scale of devastation was difficult for Americans to fully grasp. Most American cities had never experienced bombing. American factories had never been targets. American farms had never been battlefields. The destruction that Europeans lived with every day was largely abstract for the country being asked to help repair it. The physical damage was staggering. Cities across the continent had been reduced to rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Warsaw, Rotterdam. The list of devastated urban centers went on and on. Not just buildings but entire neighborhoods had been erased. Landmarks that had stood for centuries were gone. The infrastructure that made urban life possible, the water systems, the sewers, the electrical grids, had been shattered. In some cities, the rubble had not even been cleared. Mountains of broken brick and twisted steel lined the streets. People lived in basements of destroyed buildings because there was nowhere else to go. Children played in the ruins, not understanding that this was not normal, because for them it was the only world they had ever known. Transportation networks had been systematically destroyed. Railroads had been primary targets throughout the war. Bridges had been blown up by retreating armies. Rivers were clogged with debris. Roads were cratered by bombs and shells. Moving goods from one place to another, the basic function that allows an economy to operate, had become extraordinarily difficult. In many places, railroad capacity was severely reduced from pre-war levels. Bridges that had carried vital traffic remained destroyed. Rolling stock that had survived the war was wearing out without replacement parts. The arteries that had once carried the lifeblood of European commerce were severed or clogged. And this is where Moscow saw opportunity. Industrial capacity had been devastated. Factories had been bombed, stripped for parts, or dismantled entirely. The tools and machines that workers needed to produce goods were missing. The raw materials that production required were unavailable or inaccessible. Even where factories still stood, they often could not operate because they lacked coal for power, or steel for materials, or workers who had not been killed or displaced. Consider what this meant for ordinary people trying to make a living. A skilled machinist might still know his trade, but the factory where he had worked was a bombed-out shell. A tool and die maker might be ready to work, but the machines he needed were gone. An entire generation of industrial workers found their skills useless because the infrastructure that had employed them no longer existed. Agriculture had been disrupted as severely as industry. Fields had been fought over. Farmers had been conscripted. Livestock had been slaughtered. The equipment needed for modern farming had been requisitioned for military purposes. The chemical fertilizers that had increased yields before the war were no longer available. Food production had plummeted at exactly the moment when populations desperately needed to be fed. The agricultural crisis was particularly acute because it was self-reinforcing. Farmers needed fertilizer to grow crops, but fertilizer production required industrial capacity that had been destroyed. Farmers needed tractors and equipment, but factories that might have produced them could not operate. The food shortage weakened the workers who might have rebuilt the factories that might have produced the equipment that might have increased food production. Every problem made every other problem worse. The winter of 1946-47 made everything worse. It was one of the coldest in European memory. The temperatures plunged. The snow piled up. The coal that was needed for heating was in desperately short supply. People froze in their homes. Factories that might have operated were forced to shut down because there was no fuel. The rivers that might have carried goods were frozen solid. This was the kind of crisis that breaks societies. Because hunger is political. The human suffering was immense and visible. People were hungry in ways that comfortable Americans found difficult to imagine. Not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely malnourished. In several areas, diets fell to dangerously low levels. Children were growing up without adequate food. Adults were weakening from inadequate calories. The energy needed to rebuild, the physical strength to clear rubble and repair infrastructure was being sapped by simple hunger. The economic consequences of this devastation rippled outward. Without functioning transportation, goods could not move. Without coal, factories could not operate. Without factories, workers could not earn wages. Without wages, families could not buy what little food was available. Without demand, farmers had no incentive to produce. Each problem reinforced the others in a downward spiral that seemed to have no bottom. The monetary systems had been destroyed along with everything else. Currencies had been inflated into worthlessness. Black markets flourished because official markets could not function. People bartered because money had lost its meaning. The financial infrastructure that allows modern economies to operate had collapsed along with the physical infrastructure. The political implications were even more alarming for American strategists. Desperate people turned to whoever promises solutions. In several Western European countries, communist parties were gaining strength. In France and Italy, communists had significant representation in parliament. They offered an alternative to the capitalist systems that seemed to have failed. They pointed to the Soviet Union as a model of industrial development and social organization. Communist parties were not fringe movements in post-war Western Europe. They had earned credibility through their role in resisting Nazi occupation. They had organized, they had fought, and in many cases they had died for their countries. Their sacrifice gave them moral authority that more cautious political movements lacked. And now they offered a vision of radical change to populations that had little reason to believe the old systems could deliver. The fear in Washington was not that Soviet tanks would roll across the Rhine. The fear was that free elections in Western Europe might produce communist governments without a shot being fired. That the chaos and suffering could create openings that Moscow might exploit. That the Soviet sphere of influence might expand not through conquest but through the ballot box. When survival becomes political, whoever offers solutions gains power. The United States had already been providing assistance to Europe since the end of the war. Billions of dollars had flowed across the Atlantic in the form of loans, grants, and relief supplies. The problem was not that America had been ungenerous. The problem was that the assistance had been ineffective. The aid provided in 1945 and 1946 had been approached on a country-by-country basis. Each nation's needs were assessed separately. Each program was designed independently. The result was a patchwork of efforts that failed to address the interconnected nature of European economic problems. This approach reflected the way aid had traditionally been conceived. A country was in trouble. You helped that country. You measured success by whether that country improved. It made intuitive sense. It was how charitable assistance had always worked. But Europe's problems were not national problems that happened to be occurring simultaneously in multiple countries. They were continental problems that could not be solved by treating each country in isolation. The coal that Germany needed came from mines in France and Belgium. The food that Britain needed came from farms across the continent. The industrial products that everyone needed required supply chains that crossed multiple borders. The economies of Western Europe were interdependent in ways that national boundaries obscured. A factory in one country might depend on raw materials from a second country, energy from a third, and markets in a fourth. Helping any one of these countries in isolation would not solve the problem if the others remained broken. The system had to be fixed as a system. Consider the problem of coal, the fundamental resource that powered European industry. Coal production was far below pre-war levels. Part of the problem was that mines had been damaged. Part of the problem was that miners were malnourished and could not work at full capacity. Part of the problem was that transportation to move coal from mines to factories was broken. And part of the problem was that there was no coordinated system to allocate the coal that was produced to where it was most needed. A mine might be producing coal, but if the railroad to carry it was destroyed, the coal sat useless at the pithead. A factory might be ready to operate, but if no coal could reach it, the machinery sat idle. A worker might be ready to labor, but if his factory had no power, he had no job. The problem was not just production. It was the entire system of extraction, transportation, and allocation that had to be rebuilt together. No amount of aid to any single country could solve this problem. The solution required a coordinated approach that treated the European economy as an integrated system. It required someone to take responsibility for the whole picture, not just the individual pieces. American planners began to recognize this reality in early 1947. The ad hoc approach was not working. The situation on the ground was deteriorating despite the resources being poured in. Something different was needed. The analytical work that led to the recovery program happened in offices far from the suffering it was meant to address. Teams of experts studied the problems. They collected data on production, transportation, and trade. They mapped the interdependencies that connected European economies. They identified the bottlenecks that were preventing recovery. This was the operator lens of policymaking. Not generals moving armies but analysts with slide rules and memorandums. Not dramatic confrontations but careful assessments of what would work and what would not. The kind of detailed staff work that makes policy possible but rarely makes history books. The State Department's policy planning staff, newly created, took the lead in developing the conceptual framework. They gathered information from embassies across Europe. They consulted with economists who understood European economic structures. They built a picture of what was actually happening and what needed to happen for recovery to succeed. Picture a planning room in Washington in the spring of 1947. Maps covering the walls, marked with coal deposits, rail lines, and industrial centers. Analysts tracing routes that connected mines to factories to ports. Memoranda circulating with assessments of which bottlenecks, if broken, would unlock recovery in multiple countries at once. This was not glamorous work. It was the detailed, painstaking analysis that transforms ideas into executable policy. The conclusion that emerged from this analysis was clear. Europe's recovery required a comprehensive program that addressed all the major obstacles simultaneously. Energy, transportation, industrial production, agricultural output, currency stability, and international trade all had to be tackled together. Addressing any one of them in isolation would fail because they were all connected. This insight was not obvious. It required a willingness to think about economic problems in a new way. It required looking beyond national boundaries to see the larger system. It required the confidence to propose something far more ambitious than anything that had been tried before. America stopped putting out fires. It started rebuilding the entire house. The program that emerged from this analysis was unveiled in a speech at Harvard University in June 1947. Secretary of State George Marshall, speaking at the university's commencement ceremony, outlined an approach that would become known as the European Recovery Program, though history would remember it by his name. The speech itself was modest in tone. Marshall was not a dramatic orator. He spoke plainly, in the style of the military officer he had been for most of his career. The setting was academic, the audience graduates in their robes, the occasion ceremonial. But the substance of what he proposed was revolutionary. Marshall described the situation in Europe in stark terms. The visible destruction of war was obvious to everyone. But the less visible destruction of the economic fabric that held European civilization together was equally serious. The division of labor that allowed modern economies to function had broken down. The confidence that allowed trade to proceed had evaporated. The systems that connected producers to consumers, farmers to cities, factories to markets, had all been disrupted. The solution Marshall proposed was remarkable for what it was not. It was not a detailed plan imposed by Washington. It was not a list of projects that America would fund. It was not charity distributed according to American priorities. Instead, Marshall proposed that the Europeans themselves should come together and develop a comprehensive plan for recovery. They should assess their own needs. They should determine how resources could be most effectively used. They should create the coordinating mechanisms that would allow a continental recovery to proceed. America would provide the resources, but Europe would design the program. This was a different kind of leadership, not the leadership of empire, which dictates terms to subordinates. The leadership of partnership, which empowers allies to solve their own problems with support. It was a distinctly American approach, rooted in respect for self-determination even when providing assistance. This approach served multiple purposes. It reduced the burden on American planners, who could not possibly know all the details of European economic life. It ensured that European governments would have ownership of the recovery program, making them more committed to its success. It required European cooperation, which would have political benefits beyond the immediate economic goals. The requirement for European cooperation was perhaps the most significant feature of the proposal. The countries of Western Europe had spent centuries fighting each other. Nationalism had driven the conflicts that had devastated the continent twice in the 20th century. By requiring these countries to work together on recovery planning, the program was pushing them toward integration that might reduce the chances of future conflict. The genius of this approach was that it made cooperation a condition of receiving assistance. Countries that might have been reluctant to work together found that they had to if they wanted American help. The incentive structure pushed toward integration, even when historical animosities might have pushed toward separation. The amount of resources being offered was substantial. The exact figures would be worked out over time, but it was clear from the beginning that this would be a multi-year commitment of billions of dollars. This was not relief assistance for immediate needs. This was investment in comprehensive recovery that would take years to complete. The program was money, yes, but it was also economic architecture. The way the recovery program worked in practice demonstrated the systematic thinking behind it. This was not simply a matter of writing checks. It was a carefully designed intervention that addressed the specific bottlenecks preventing European recovery. The first priority was energy. Without coal, nothing else could function. Factories could not operate, homes could not be heated, transportation could not move. The program invested heavily in restoring coal production and improving the distribution systems that moved coal to where it was needed. Mines were repaired, miners were fed so they could work at full capacity. Railroad cars were allocated to coal transport. The attention to coal was not glamorous, but it was essential. Coal was the foundation on which everything else rested. Without solving the coal problem, nothing else would work. The program understood this and acted accordingly. The second priority was transportation. The economic integration that recovery required was impossible without the ability to move goods. Railroads had to be rebuilt. Bridges had to be repaired. Ports had to be restored to operation. The program provided the materials and equipment needed to restore the transportation network, and it helped coordinate the work across national boundaries. Rivers that had been clogged with debris were cleared. Canals that had fallen into disrepair were restored. The inland waterway system that had carried so much of European commerce was brought back to life. Every improvement in transportation capacity allowed the economy to function a little better. The third priority was industrial production. Europe needed to manufacture the goods that would employ its workers and generate the exports that would balance its trade. The program provided raw materials that European factories needed. It provided machinery to replace equipment that had been destroyed. It provided technical assistance to improve productivity. American industrial experts traveled to Europe to share knowledge about production methods. Techniques that had been developed in American factories were introduced to European plants. The productivity gains that had made American industry so efficient were transferred to help European industry compete. The fourth priority was agricultural production. Europe needed to feed itself without depending on imports it could not afford. The program provided fertilizers, tractors, and other inputs that farmers needed. It helped restore the productivity of land that had been damaged by war. The agricultural assistance was particularly important because food was the most immediate need. People who were hungry could not work effectively. Workers who could not work could not rebuild. The cycle had to be broken. and providing the means for increased food production was essential to breaking it. The fifth priority was currency stability. Without stable currencies, trade could not proceed efficiently. The chaos of inflation and currency manipulation was strangling economic activity. The program supported currency reforms that restored confidence in European money and facilitated normal commercial transactions. These priorities were not addressed sequentially but simultaneously. The whole point was that they were interconnected. Improving transportation allowed coal to reach factories. Coal allowed factories to operate. Factories employed workers who could afford to buy food. Food allowed farmers to justify increased production. Production generated exports that earned foreign exchange. Foreign exchange supported stable currencies. Each improvement supported the others. The resources flowing from America were substantial. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying food, fuel, and raw materials. Machinery was loaded onto freighters and delivered to European ports. Technical experts traveled to share knowledge about industrial processes that could improve productivity. The scale of the operation was enormous. Picture a European port in 1948. Cranes swinging crates from American freighters onto waiting trucks. Dock workers unloading bags of grain, crates of machine parts, barrels of fuel. Warehouses filling with supplies that would be distributed across the continent. It was an American logistical effort on a scale that many recognized from wartime supply operations, now turned toward reconstruction rather than destruction. But the resources were only part of the story. The coordination was equally important. The program created mechanisms for Europeans to work together in ways they never had before. Governments that had viewed each other with suspicion learned to cooperate on practical problems. The habits of collaboration developed during the recovery program laid groundwork for the deeper integration that would follow in later decades. The psychological effect was perhaps as important as the material assistance. The sense that recovery was possible, that things would get better, that there was reason to hope. This changed how people thought about their situation. When you believe that improvement is coming, you behave differently than when you believe that things will only get worse. You invest, you save, you plan for the future. The confidence that the recovery program inspired was itself a force for recovery. The Soviet strategy depended on desperation. The American answer was to remove it. The recovery program was technically open to all European nations, including those in the Soviet sphere. This was deliberate. American planners wanted to avoid appearing to divide Europe. They wanted to put the onus on Moscow to refuse assistance rather than appearing to exclude the Soviet Union. But the conditions attached to the program were fundamentally incompatible with how the Soviet system operated. Participating countries would need to provide detailed economic data. They would need to coordinate their recovery plans with other participating nations. They would need to accept a degree of transparency and integration that was impossible for centrally planned economies that guarded information jealously. The Soviet leadership understood immediately what the program represented. It was not merely economic assistance. It was a mechanism for organizing Western Europe into an integrated bloc aligned with American interests. The coordination required by the program would create ties between Western European countries that would pull them away from any potential Soviet influence. The recovery it would foster would make these countries stronger and less susceptible to communist appeal. Moscow's response was swift and negative. The Soviet Union would not participate. But more significantly, Moscow pressured countries within its sphere to refuse as well. Czechoslovakia presented the most dramatic case. The Czech government had initially expressed interest in participating. Czechoslovakia still maintained some degree of independence within the Soviet sphere at this point. The possibility of receiving American assistance was attractive to a country struggling with economic difficulties. The Czech decision to express interest was not made lightly. The government understood the risks. But the economic situation was difficult enough that the potential benefits seemed worth exploring. For a brief moment, it seemed that at least one country in the Soviet sphere might participate in the recovery program. But Stalin summoned Czech leaders to Moscow and made clear that participation was unacceptable. The meeting was reportedly tense. The Czechs were left with no doubt about Soviet displeasure. Czechoslovakia withdrew its expression of interest. The message to other countries in the Soviet sphere was unmistakable. Any temptation to engage with the recovery program would be met with Soviet intervention. Poland similarly showed initial interest before backing away under Soviet pressure. Other Eastern European countries did not even get that far. The Soviet position was clear and non-negotiable. This Soviet reaction had consequences that Moscow may not have fully anticipated. By forcing countries in its sphere to refuse assistance, the Soviet Union made the division of Europe more stark and more visible. The recovery program became a Western project, reinforcing the separation between East and West. The Iron Curtain that Churchill had described became more solid as a result of Soviet choices. The Soviet refusal also revealed something about Moscow's priorities. Stalin apparently feared the effects of integration with the West more than he valued the economic benefits that participation might have brought. Maintaining control over the countries in the Soviet sphere was more important than allowing them to recover more quickly. The fear of losing influence outweighed the potential gains from cooperation. Politically, the contrast was clear to many observers. The United States was offering help. Moscow was preventing countries from accepting it. The difference in approach was visible for anyone willing to see it. Stalin avoided an opening. But he paid a price. He revealed his fear of losing control. The effects of the recovery program became visible over the following years. The statistics told part of the story. Industrial production rose, agricultural output increased. Trade between European countries expanded. The economic indicators that had been so alarming in 1947 began to improve. The recovery was not instantaneous. It took time for the investments to produce results. It took time for the coordinated approach to generate the synergies that made it effective. But by 1948 and 1949, the trend lines were clearly moving in the right direction. But the numbers only captured part of what was happening. The recovery was not just about more coal being mined or more steel being produced. It was about the restoration of normalcy, the return of predictability, the revival of confidence that made it possible for people to plan for the future. Consider what it meant for a factory worker in France or a farmer in Italy to see the economy beginning to function again. The desperation that had made radical alternatives attractive began to fade. The communist parties that had seemed like the wave of the future found their appeal diminishing. Why vote for revolution when things were getting better under the existing system? The political consequences were significant. The governments of Western Europe stabilized. The coalitions that had seemed fragile found their footing. The elections that American planners had feared might produce communist victories instead produced outcomes favorable to the Western alliance. This was not entirely due to the recovery program. Many factors shaped European politics in this period. But the economic improvement that the program fostered was clearly part of the story. Governments that could deliver rising living standards were more popular than governments that could not. The recovery program helped Western European governments deliver. The integration that the program required also began to change how Europeans thought about their neighbors. Countries that had fought wars against each other found themselves cooperating on practical economic problems. The habits of collaboration that developed during the recovery program created foundations for deeper integration. The European institutions that would emerge in later decades had their origins in the coordination mechanisms created to administer American assistance. For the United States, the program demonstrated something about American power that military strength alone could not show. America could be a constructive force in the world. American resources could be used to build up rather than tear down. American organizational capacity could tackle problems on a continental scale. The recovery program showcased American capabilities in a way that benefited everyone involved. The strategic benefits were substantial. A stronger Western Europe was a more effective ally against Soviet expansion. Countries that were prospering had less reason to seek alternative arrangements with Moscow. The investment in European recovery was also an investment in American security. The Soviet Union watched these developments with growing concern. The recovery of Western Europe was proceeding faster than Moscow had expected. The chaos that might have provided opportunities for communist advance was giving way to stability that favored the existing governments. The weapon of desperation was being taken away. Moscow's response was to consolidate control more tightly within its own sphere. If the West was organizing itself more effectively, then the East would have to be organized more rigidly. The division that the recovery program helped create was matched by Soviet efforts to ensure that no Eastern European country would be tempted to look westward. This tightening of control had consequences that would shape the Cold War for decades. Countries that might have found some room for independent action found themselves under stricter supervision. Economic planning became more centralized. Political control became more complete. The Soviet sphere became more distinct from the Western sphere. The Soviet leadership also looked for ways to demonstrate that Western recovery did not mean Western dominance. If the West was finding its footing, Moscow would need to show that it could still challenge Western positions. The competition would continue, though on different terms than Moscow might have preferred. When the rebuilding started to work, Moscow looked for another way to stop the momentum. The recovery program represented a new way of thinking about American power in the world. Military strength remained important. The ability to deter aggression through force was still fundamental to security, but the recovery program demonstrated that economic resources could be deployed strategically to achieve objectives that military force could not. This was soft power before the term was invented. The ability to achieve outcomes through attraction rather than coercion. The capacity to shape the environment in ways that made favorable outcomes more likely. The recovery program did not force Western European countries to align with the United States. It made alignment attractive by providing benefits that countries could not obtain elsewhere. The program also demonstrated the importance of coordination and organization. Throwing money at a problem was not enough. The resources had to be deployed intelligently, addressing the specific obstacles that were preventing recovery. The systematic approach that characterized the program, the careful analysis of problems, and the coordinated attack on multiple fronts simultaneously showed that complex challenges could be addressed through careful planning. For European participants, the program represented something new in international relations. A great power was offering assistance on terms that respected the recipient's dignity and agency. The Europeans were not simply receiving charity. They were partners in designing a recovery that they would implement. This relationship was different from the imperial patterns that had characterized great power behavior in the past. The long-term effects extended far beyond the immediate recovery. The integration that the program fostered laid groundwork for the European institutions that would emerge in subsequent decades. The habits of cooperation, the mechanisms for coordination, the experience of working together on shared problems, all of these contributed to a European trajectory that would eventually produce deeper political and economic integration. The success of the recovery program also influenced American thinking about foreign assistance more broadly. The model of comprehensive economic development assistance, coordinated with recipients and focused on systemic change rather than simple relief, would be applied in other contexts. Not always successfully. The specific conditions that made the program work in Europe were not always replicable elsewhere. But the basic concept of strategic development assistance became a permanent feature of American foreign policy. The relationship between economics and security that the program embodied also became a permanent feature of American strategic thinking. Economic strength was understood to be a component of national power, not separate from it. Investment in the economic health of allies was investment in security. The distinction between military and economic instruments of policy became less sharp. The recovery program was not the end of challenges in Europe. Problems would continue. Crises would arise. The Cold War would produce confrontations that would test the stability that the program helped create. The Soviet Union was not going to accept Western recovery without response. Within months of the program's implementation, that response would come. Moscow would seek to demonstrate that American resources and Western organization could be challenged, that the Soviet Union still held cards that could be played, that the momentum of Western recovery could be disrupted. The test would come in a location that illustrated the precarious position of the West in Europe. A city deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, connected to the West only by narrow corridors that Soviet forces could close at will. A place where geography seemed to give Moscow every advantage. The recovery program rebuilt Western Europe. Moscow answered by tightening its grip and testing a new line. In 1948, that test came to a single city inside the Soviet zone: Berlin.